Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly conversation on HCI and the future of work. I'm Erin Solovey from WPI in Massachusetts. So if possible, it would be great to turn on your camera. We'd love to see everyone, but keep your mic muted. So I'd like to thank all the other organizers and the technical program chairs. I see a lot of people here, Max, Navina, Toby, Shadan, and then Orit and Andrew. And then our student volunteers, Alberta has been keeping us all together. She's the assistant to the technical program chairs and is helping so much behind the scenes. We have a web chair, Isabel, and Nabil does the video and accessibility. We also want to thank the National Science Foundation for funding this. And so I'll just explain for people who haven't been to these before how these conversations work. The first part is recorded, as you saw. The recording has already been started. We're very much looking forward to your questions from the audience. Please just feel free at any time to type questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience. And then stay with us for the second part. Following the conversation, we'll stop the recording and continue with more informal social event. So now I'd like to welcome our guest, Alvitta Ottley. She is an assistant professor in computer science and engineering at the Washington University in St. Louis, with a courtesy appointment in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. And she's the director of the Visual Data Analysis Group there. Her current research interests include information visualization, human-computer interaction, and visual analytics. With funding from the US Department of Defense and National Science Foundation, her research pursues areas such as learning and modeling user behavior, individual differences, and personalized health risk communication. Her work has been published in leading conferences and journals such as CHI, InfoVis, VAST, and TVCG. She has also won several awards, including the NSF CRII Award and the Career Award and the 2022 Euroviz Young Researcher Award. So I'm really happy to have this conversation on uniting human and machine intelligence to support data discovery and decision-making. So welcome, Alvitta, and everyone else.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So to start off, your research group is the Visual Data Analysis Group, and I want to start by having you give a quick description of what visual analytics is and why it's important when thinking about the future of work.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. So visual analytics broadly is an area where we look at how to use data visualization to support decision-making, hypothesis generation, and data exploration. Oftentimes, these are in like more complex scenarios. So think about like someone who's an intelligence analyst trying to understand a large amount of data, or a scientist trying to understand a high-dimensional data space. So what that typically means is that there is some sort of algorithm in the background. So there's a machine learning algorithm that might, for instance, do like a high-dimensional projection into a 2D space. And so oftentimes what visual analytics is, it's human and computer collaborating together to solve a problem where neither the human or the computer can solve them by itself. And so we do a lot of that in our lab, but the focus of my lab is a lot broader, because my perspective is to understand, to actually support people doing these complex tasks. We have to understand who they are. We have to understand how people solve problems. So we bring in lots of things from psychology, where we're looking at how individual differences in personality, experience, and cognitive abilities might impact how someone might solve a problem, how they would use visualizations. And we apply that in domains such as, I touched on the Department of Defense, where we collaborate with intelligence analysts who want to explore lots of data. We also collaborate with scientists who want to discover new materials, and that might mean exploring a high-dimensional space. And we also collaborate with people in medicine, and we're looking at how do you communicate to everyday people? How do you communicate complex statistics that people might not be able to understand?
Okay, great. So, so can you describe a bit about the disconnect that you currently see? So in the abstract, we had the disconnect between what you see in the work in AI and machine learning and all the advances that have been made, and then the reality in the fields that you're looking at, such as medical and scientific discovery.
Yeah, so here's one extreme example. There is a doctor somewhere right now looking at a bunch of lines going across the screen, trying to look at EEG data to figure out if someone is having a seizure. At the same time, there are dozens of machine learning algorithms that touts that they have like 90-something% accuracy at predicting if someone is having a seizure. And so we have advances in research supposedly solving these real world problems, and we have people in the real world not using these technology. And so what I see is, number one, we're not talking to each other. And I think one of the problem is that we need to start like putting these doctors and these machine learning experts in the same space and try to get them to speak the same language. If you've ever done any kind of cross-disciplinary research, you realize that it takes a while to just even understand what the other person is saying. So one is that we need to talk to each other, but two, I feel like the solutions that we develop don't really take into consideration the workflow of the current doctor. So like, why would the doctor change what they're doing? They already have a busy schedule, and then to try to figure out what this algorithm is doing and try to fit it into their workflow, there's no real incentive to do that. And then there are issues of trust, which we're going to get into later. But why would a doctor just like listen to a machine learning algorithm? Usually these are black box solutions that would say, yes, there's a seizure, and we don't have any good ways to explain what the algorithm is doing, especially in these sort of like complex scenarios. So there are lots of confounding factors there that I think are leading to the disconnect between what we're doing in research and what people are doing in practice. And I do feel that we need to bridge that gap, and bridging that gap could have like really immense and positive impact in society.
Yeah, that's very true. So with that, where do you think the field of visualization and visual analytics comes in?
So a lot of times, so if we take a step back, visualization is just a means of communication. And in my lab, one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we use visualization as a means of communicating between the human and the machine. So in visual analytics, you typically have some sort of algorithm in the back end that's doing something, and you have a human that's doing something else. How do you expand that bandwidth of communication between the human and the machine? So some of the things that we do is we're trying to use the visualization itself as a way to learn what someone is doing. So if I think of interactions as a way of a human communicating their intentions through the visualization, now this is a language, interaction with the visualization is a language, then I can try to infer what they're trying to do, try to decode that language and use that to help the machine or their algorithms in the back end like be better collaborators. On the other hand, I can also make changes to the interface itself to help the human understand what the algorithm is trying to do. And so I'm a lot of times I'm thinking about how do you use the visualization itself as a communication medium, and how do you just like what can you learn from interactions, and how do you expand that bandwidth of communication, as I said.
Oh. Yeah, I think that you're really touching on an important problem to get these into the real world. So another area that you've really worked on and goes along with this is thinking, not just understanding the user, but adapting algorithms and visualizations to better support the users. So in order to do that, what what types of information would you need to be detecting and how frequently, and how might the visual analytics tool change? How would that all work?
That is exactly what I'm trying to figure out right now. So what I know that we've done quite a lot of work developing algorithms. So in terms of like what can we detect, it turns out that I can, to some degree, predict your personality by just looking at the interactions that you're performing. And personality traits actually play a huge role in how we solve problems and our preferences for interfaces. We've developed algorithms to predict the next interaction. So I know where you are now. I can predict with a high likelihood that you're going to be clicking on or exploring this other space in the visualization next. We've also used that information to learn about people's exploration biases. So, and I'm using bias as a very neutral word right now, because bias isn't necessarily bad. I can look at your if you're exploring a data space, and for instance, you might be interested in people in a specific area. You are biased toward that specific information. And so I can leverage that to then maybe triage more information that might be relevant to you. Bias could also be bad. I can like bring attention that, oh, you've only explored this area. Maybe you might want to explore another area. And so we are actively trying to both leverage what we already know we can learn from interactions. So think about what are things that we can do to adapt the interface to help someone. So that might be maybe bringing attention to bias or leveraging that bias to provide more information that might be relevant. But we are also actively trying to think about like, how do we expand what we can learn? Because in terms of what you can click on next, these are very low level information. To some extent, your personality traits, I can tell you there's a correlation there, but we're kind of like limited in like what we can learn. So we're trying to push the boundaries a little bit and see, can I learn what intent is? Can I learn what a higher level goal is? And it's easier said than done, but we're actively trying to do that right now.
Oh, interesting. And with this stuff, like detecting personality traits, and I know that you've looked a lot about individual differences. And so, why can't the same visualization or algorithm work for everyone? And, as, I don't know, thinking about the future of work too.
Because everyone is different, right? Your background, everything about you make you different from me. And especially in the future of work where we're trying to diversify our workplace as well, I think that also comes with thinking about what that means for the tools that we're currently using. And so an easy way to even like think about it, or like people with disabilities, like we're limited, like how do you create a visualization for someone with visual impairment, like that it doesn't really fit. And so that's like one obvious way of thinking about it. But even on subtle levels, it turns out that, like, for instance, one of the traits that we've been looking at for a very long time is locus of control. And locus of control describes how much you feel in control of external events. So this is a spectrum. So you have people who are external, and people who are external believe that they are controlled by external events. So things happen to them. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have internal locus of control, and they believe that they make things happen. So an example of this is someone like gets in a car accident. Someone with internal locus of control would think that, they could have done a better job to avoid the accident. Whereas someone with external locus of control might think, well, they're just unlucky, like this bad thing happened to me. But it turns out that this specific trait predicts a lot of things about how we live our everyday life, and it also predicts how we solve problems. And so some of the research that we found is that when we give one design, one visualization to internals, they perform well on it. But you give that same visualization to externals, and their their speed and accuracy suffer significantly. And vice versa, the interface that worked for the externals don't necessarily work for the internals. And so that is just one example that we found, but I'm sure there are lots more out there where there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for anyone, for anything.
Interesting. So I do want to also open up to the audience to ask their questions. If anyone, you can either write in the chat, you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself. It looks like we have one question already. Max, I don't know, I know you were in the car. I don't know if you want to ask it, or if not, I can ask it for you. And other people can raise their hands too. Okay, I think he's busy. So Max was asking how, if this relates and how it relates to the concerns in the FACT conference with trust and accountability and relating to assuming what the visual action is showing or the algorithm around it is inferring.
Yes, trust is trust is extremely important right now. So one of the recent work that we had, we developed an algorithm that would then make suggestions to people to further explore based on what we believe they might be interested in. And it turns out that a huge percentage of our study population did not at all interact with the suggestions. And they also were the ones who said that they didn't trust the system. And I do think, though, that some distrust, some level of distrust is healthy. And we're actively thinking about how do you calibrate that? Because the same way where I gave the example of doctors right now who are looking at EEG, struggling with it, not at all using algorithmic solutions, there are other people out there where they're trying to explore some audio data. And the standard way of doing that is to transcribe the data, use some sort of algorithm to transcribe the data, and then you browse the transcription. But oftentimes there's some overtrust there. So they just take the transcript and never really go back to the audio. And so we want some healthy level of trust and distrust, but humans are complicated. And so I feel like if there's an evidence of you shouldn't trust someone, then it's hard to then build the trust again. And so we're trying to think about how human psychology works with trust and distrust, and how do you strike that balance? I don't have the answer to that, but yes, I do think that these things are very important.
Okay, and other questions? Andrew, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. This is really fascinating. Thank you. So I'm curious, are you focused on visualizations for individuals and this human machine collaboration for individuals, or are you also looking at teams? And then I'm really curious about are the teams co-located? Are they synchronous, asynchronous? So there's a host of questions.
Yeah, I haven't been. So we've largely been focusing on individuals. There is some opportunity with an existing collaboration we have with the NGA to start thinking about teams, and that we're thinking about it more like a distributed systems approach with independent agents. And we're actively collaborating with people in AI who are thinking about these in the context of robots in a manufacturing plant with who share a same goal. And can we take a model like that and apply it to humans? Maybe in some limited context, because as I said again, humans are very tricky and unpredictable. But we're thinking about that space, but I feel like there are lots of things I still need to figure out with the one-on-one before we expand, though that might be a flaw, but never mind.
Okay. And I see a question from Orit. Do you want to ask?
Alvitta, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see you. And my question is really based on your comment on how difficult it is to do interdisciplinary research and the observation that it takes a while to even understand what your collaborators are saying and claiming and a new terminology. What are your thoughts about the best ways to prepare students at the undergraduate level and then at the graduate level to conduct kind of in general interdisciplinary research, but more specifically in this area?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Alvitta. It's good to see you. So one of the things that I tend to do, and maybe I kind of like cheat a little bit, I actively recruit people who have like diverse backgrounds. And so a lot of the students I recruit may have had like a major in, like one of my students majored in architecture as an undergrad. Some of the students that I work with also have like a major in psychology or economics. And so, but I see that more and more now, and at least I don't know if this is unique to WashU. I don't think that is unique to my university, but there are lots of students that are now doing double majors. And I think that is the future where you learn, there's someone who may have done a major or minor in biology, and those are the people that I bring onto the team. I also actively, from my graduate students, I actively have them take courses in other departments, specifically psychology, for instance. In computer science, the type of statistics we learn isn't really helpful to the type of statistics we need for HCI research. And so my students go to the psychology department and take statistics there. So I would say do not be afraid to explore beyond your specific department and take courses elsewhere. You might be surprised what you learn. The other thing is, do not be afraid to collaborate. Like I realize I'm like a jack of all trades, but I can't be a master at everything. And so I know a little bit about a lot of things, but I know when to collaborate with someone. I know when to seek out someone who's good in AI or seek out someone who's good in machine learning so that they bring a depth of knowledge that I might not have. And so, yeah, collaborate, take more courses, and just don't be afraid to just intermingle and talk to other people.
Great, thank you.
Other questions?
If there are no other questions, I do have another question, which is unrelated. So we talk about visual analytics, and I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on the potential of conducting visual analytics with new ways of interaction, for example, virtual reality and augmented reality.
Yes, thanks for the question. I have been thinking about that lately because, as I said, I've been collaborating with scientists, and they have lots of dimensions they want to explore. And I don't know why this is the norm, but they put everything in a triangle and look at ternary diagrams. So they only look at 3 dimensions at a time. And to look at more dimensions, if they're swapping out the dimensions, or maybe even like switch it to a 3D triangle, which is very, very strange. But I believe what that is really, what we really need to accept in the visualization community is like acknowledging the limitations of visualization. So right now we're on a 2-dimensional screen. And so anything that we do is limited to these 2 dimensions. And so we have to do like a high dimensional projection down to the 2-dimensional space. And so I'm actively thinking about how do we expand that. And I think that means AR or VR, or like I have a student right now thinking about adding sound to our visualization to add another dimension. So it is not that common. And maybe that's another place where I need to like find a collaborator who know more about these things. But I'm very curious, and I realize now that it's something that we have to do in the visualization community because 2D is just not enough anymore. That was a great question.
Yeah, other questions? Feel free to just unmute or raise your hand.
I had a bit more of a question about, thanks for answering my earlier question, by the way, that was great. I was nodding along the whole time going, yes, I completely agree with what you're saying. I'm still intrigued more about this working with real industry and seeing the differences when it comes to actually looking at people trying to do this type of work. Were there kind of like assumptions that you feel like are being held in the academic community about what someone will do when they look at visualizations that you're just not seeing them do at all in the real world? Or, you know, maybe vice versa. Maybe there are things they're doing that you had no expectation they would do until you watch them do it.
Yeah, I mean, immediately a lot of things just come to mind. For example, I'm collaborating with people in the Department of Defense, as I said, and we created this visualization for them to explore. It was a synthetic data set, but the scenario is that there is an outbreak and there was a chemical attack. They don't know. They didn't really know that, but people are getting sick in this fictitious city, and all they had was social media posts to try to figure out like who's sick, why are they sick, is this disease contained? And so we, on our end, we build like this map visualization for them to explore the space. We built all these like this really complex dashboard, and after talking to them, they're like, "Okay, can you just add a table to it?" And like, why do you need a table? And we ended up adding the table in the end, and we had about 20 actual intelligence analysts come in and use the system. And for the most of the time, they were just like scrolling the table. And this is now something that I did not expect at all. And I'm trying to like figure out like, how do you bridge that gap? Because we in the visualization community, like there was a map on the other half of the screen and they ignored the map and utilized the table. Probably more inefficient, but I think it's based on how they thought about the problem. And so someone who's an intelligent analyst, they thought like, okay, well, there's a disease that's being spread. Maybe there's a super spreader event. And so they were looking for an event and not necessarily a location on the map. And so the map didn't fit the questions they wanted to ask. And so, yes, we need to definitely talk to more people and realize some of these things, but I don't know to what extent these are one-off or individual solutions for each domain or each person even. Which is a little bit daunting to think about, honestly.
That's really interesting. So presumably they would have liked the map if they wanted to suddenly know, you know, where was this? But you're saying the map was not their primary interest, and so despite being presumably very useful.
Yeah. So yes, there are lots of examples like that I can think about, and it completely just threw out all the things that I assumed before and did something else. But I think it's helpful, but it kind of like maybe highlights something that we need to change in our community, at least in the visualization community. If I go and say like, people are not using the visualization at all, they just use a table. What is my contribution to the visualization field? And they're probably going to say, well, maybe you didn't design the map well, or maybe you didn't do something well. And so it just like points to difficulties of publishing and limitations for like what constitutes a contribution in a specific area. I do believe that our communities don't value these type of work as much, but I think Kai is like their default for all of that kind of work. It's like a catch-all for everything.
Okay, thank you. So we're gonna switch over to the more informal conversation next, but before I do that, I just want to mention that next week we have another guest, Mayara Costa Figueredo, so join us next week. And we can stop the recording and stay on, and we'll have more informal conversation. Feel free to unmute yourself, chat about more about these topics or really anything else. Thanks.